In the Pokemon TCG, you win the game in one of four ways. You either take all 6 of your prize cards.
That's gonna be it. The next Adrenabrain perfect math. Isaiah takes the KO.
Knock out your opponent's only Pokemon in play.
Obvious choices for back order, and you get to put it straight onto Oranguru and then use it for, oh yeah, it's Precious Trolley, getting all of your basic Pokemon out. Whatever 5 basic Pokemon Ryuki wants to get on the board here are coming.
Here we go, look at all the pieces.
And there we go, Ryuki is gonna be.
Your opponent concedes the game to you.
That fairy zone on the lily.
Oh, he's ready to just give up the game. It's over.
Or you run your opponent out of cards in their deck so they can't draw a card to start their turn.
Game. So there's the attack from Grammar.
Wow.
But now we just see Penny picking up. Chiyu goes in the active, and Azul takes a lead in this final, 1-0.
The vast majority of decks win through taking all 6 of their prize cards, and some even try to have the option to knock out the opponent's only Pokemon in play with donk cards like Latios EX with Fast Raid, Pheromosa GX with a similar attack, Iron Valiant EX's Tachyon Bits, and Pecharunt's Toxic Subjugation. However, it's the last way to win a game that starts off today's video about the history of wall strategies in the Pokemon TCG. So, let's talk about it. The earliest wall strategy I can find in the Pokemon TCG is a deck built around Chansey. Chansey had a massive amount of HP at the time and was a basic Pokemon in the first few sets of the game. And with item cards like Scoop Up, Energy Removal, Super Energy Removal, and Item Finder, you could win games by stalling out the opponent's attacks and running them out of energy. This also seems to have contributed to a basic heavy meta ruling the game, with attackers like Hitmonchan, Electabuzz, and Mewtwo. However, I'm mostly going to be talking about cards from the 2015 standard format and on, because wall strategies that only aimed to deck the opponent out never caught on as mainstream meta decks until then, since the deck out win condition wasn't often exploited. Sure, there were mill decks like Durant back in the black and white era that were quite decent, but there was nothing like the second place US Nationals deck from 2015. Enrique Avila and his testing group were playing something truly unbelievable at the time. Wailord EX from Primal Clash has 250 HP as a basic Pokemon. For reference, nowadays most evolving EX Pokemon have 250 or more HP. And some basic Pokemon EX come pretty close too, like Raging Bull EX. But think about it, this is 2015. 250 was by far the most amount of HP a Pokemon had at the time, with even more HP than every Mega Pokemon. Wailord EX was seen as a meme card because despite being very tanky, its attack kinda sucked. For 5 straight water energy, you're doing 120 damage, and you do put yourself to sleep as well. This is nowhere near the amount of damage that energy cost would suggest. For example, Mega Manectric EX had an attack that did 110 damage for just 2 energy, and it also accelerated 2 basic energy from the discard pile to one of your bench Pokemon, while Wailord's secondary effect literally puts it to sleep. Enrique and his group, however, saw what Wailord's true potential could be. You see, the early XY format had given us some of the most game-breaking item and supporter cards we have ever seen. VS Seeker, despite being mediocre at best in its previous outing, was a format staple and instant 4 of in every deck when it was reprinted. Team Flare Grunt is one of the best energy removal cards ever, and the same goes for other cards like Enhanced Hammer and Xerosic that were legal. Damage reduction and healing cards were also quite diverse, with the Rusty's Stadium card from Primal Clash healing 30 damage from a water or lightning Pokemon on each turn, the Hard Charm Tool card which reduced all damage done by 20, Cassius which shuffles a Pokemon you have in play into your deck which removes all damage, Max Potion which heals all damage from one of your Pokemon but discards all energy, and AZ which put a Pokemon in play into your hand and discarded all attached cards. With all of this, the Wall Stall archetype was born. Wailord EX and Suicune were the only Pokemon present. Wailord was almost impossible to remove in one hit, especially due to the timing of this deck, when Grass-type attackers were super rare to see and almost non-existent, meaning Wailord basically had no weakness. Suicune was immune to damage from Pokemon EX with this ability, so even if the opponent had a powerful EX Pokemon they were powering up on the bench that could potentially one-shot a Wailord, all the player needed to do was AZ their only Wailord, bench 2 Suicune, and the opponent basically lost the game since they couldn't attack with another Pokemon. Enrique placed second at the event, losing to the GOAT Jason Klosinski in the finals, and his friend Brandon Zettel placed 9th with the exact same 60. This was really impressive. and it was so cool to see this deck really change the way the game was played from having to take prizes to simply staying alive. Wailord was one of the first strategies fully built around walling that was actually pretty good. But there were some other walling cards in the X and Y era that also saw success. Regice has an attack for 3 energy that does 70 damage and prevents all damage done to Regice next turn by Pokemon EX. This mostly saw play in decks that abused double colorless energy and Max Elixir. Max Elixir is one of the best item cards ever, which looks at the top 6 of your deck and attaches a basic energy to one of your bench basic Pokemon. Regice was great in these types of decks since these cards could more reasonably power up the attack. Decks like Turbo Seismitoad and Vileplume loved having this option, since Seismitoad decks already played Water Energy and Max Elixir, not to mention that Regice could cover up some of Seismitoad's weaknesses, and Vileplume decks could use 1 Rainbow Energy and a DCE to not only item lock with Vileplume's ability, but wall at the same time. Another option similar to Regice was Jolteon EX from Generations. Its second attack also does 70 damage for 3 energy, but it instead makes Jolteon immune to damage from all basic Pokemon. This is a cool tech for Vileplume decks mostly, since it could wall out Volcanion EX, which could be a difficult matchup depending on how fast Vileplume was established. Giratina EX released in the same set as Vileplume, Ancient Origins, and was immune to damage from Mega Pokemon thanks to its ability. However, Hex Maniac was quite strong, which turned off all abilities during your opponent's next turn, and it could be used as a tech for Tina in Mega Evolution decks like Mega Ray or eventually Mega Mewtwo potentially if they didn't play Garbodor to also turn off abilities. Additionally, in Evolutions, this Mew card released, with an ability making it immune to damage from Evolution Pokemon. However, it's worth noting that wall Pokemon that block damage with their attacks like Jolteon and Regice were also kept in check somewhat by the Pokemon Ranger supporter card from Steam Siege, which removed the effect of all attacks on all Pokemon, allowing Pokemon to pierce through. With the prominence of VS Seeker and Town Map, which lets you look at your prize cards, a one-of Ranger tech could spell doom for walling strategies, except for Vileplume of course, which disabled item cards, which is also part of the reason most of these wall Pokemon were paired with Vileplume. Once Sun and Moon sets started releasing, we kept getting more and more Pokemon that would become pretty good walls. Xurkitree GX was immune to all damage from Pokemon with special energy attached, and was a great option in a meta dominated by double colorless energy. This saw play in more niche wall and control strategies, and it even got second at a Champions League tournament towards the end of its lifetime in Standard, which I'll be getting to a little bit later. It saw lots of play in Expanded actually as a tech for Night March, a dominant expanded archetype that only played double colorless energy. Regigigas became one of the faces of wall strategies during Sun and Moon. It has 180 HP, which was insanely high at the time for a basic 1 prize Pokemon. For reference, the average basic Pokemon EX only had 170, and same for the basic GX Pokemon. This was a single prize Pokemon though. And on top of that, the tool card Ancient Crystal was printed, giving the Regi Pokemon is attached to a damage reduction of 30 while attached, meaning you needed 210 damage to one-hit KO Regigigas with a crystal attached. And it wasn't even that worth it since you only got 1 prize card for doing this. This card and Hoopa from Shining Legends, who had an ability making it immune to GX and EX Pokemon, formed a wall stall duo in the early Sun and Moon and mid Sun and Moon era. This was only possible thanks to the broken Lusamine supporter card and Acerola. Lusamine from Crimson Invasion is one of the most poorly designed cards ever. It lets you put 2 in any combination of Stadium and supporter cards from the discard pile into your hand. However, for some reason this effect doesn't prevent the user from grabbing Lusamine as one of their 2 cards, meaning you could infinitely loop resources by using Lusamine to grab 1 Lusamine and another supporter or Stadium. The supporter you almost always recovered was Acerola from Burning Shadows, which put one of your Pokemon that had any damage on it into your hand with all attached cards. This meant that if you could force the opponent to 3-shot each of your wall Pokemon, you could tank the first hit, Lusamine for a Lusamine and Acerola, tank the second hit, Acerola, promote the same Pokemon, tank another hit, and then Lusamine again and loop forever. These decks would often play Team Rocket's Handiwork from Fates Collide as well, which flips 2 coins and mills 2 cards from the top of the opponent's deck for each heads, providing an easily loopable win condition to go along with infinite walling and healing. Max Potion also was still legal, and these decks always played 4 of this card to fully heal the active with an item card, allowing you to use a different supporter like Rocket's Handiwork or Plumeria instead of needing to use Acerola or Lusamine. This combo was pretty toxic, but also very fragile, and paired with some decent counterplay in deck building, this archetype was mostly in an overall healthy spot. It won a few regionals and had numerous top cuts with different variants popping up, with different wall Pokemon like Wishy-Washy GX, which had just a massive HP, Steelix, which also had massive HP, and eventually Lucario and Melmetal Tag Team GX. This was the next phase of walling archetypes going into the tag team era. It had filthy HP, a GX attack that made it and all of your other metal Pokemon take 30 less damage for the rest of the game, and the Metal Frying Pan tool card was available, turning off its weakness to fire. And with the multitude of powerful fire type attackers during this era like Blacephalon, and Reshizard, this mattered a lot. This Pokemon was the build around for the second place Champions League Shiba Wall Stall deck with Hoopa, Luke Metal, and other high HP metal single prize Pokemon like Genesect and even Solgaleo Prism Star. The Sun and Moon era was arguably the peak of walling archetypes in the Pokemon TCG, but that doesn't mean there haven't been some incredible wall decks ever since. Going into Sword and Shield, more and more wall Pokemon were printed. Obstagoon was immune to all damage from basic Pokemon with this attack, and paired with Galarian Zigzagoon to ping damage to the opponent's Pokemon, and Shadowbox Mimikyu for GX Pokemon ability lock, this was a solid archetype that won a regional. Altaria had an ability making it immune to GX and V Pokemon, making it a decent stage 1 wall option that got top 8 at a regional in this deck from Sander, which is so insane I'm not even gonna try to explain it. This Decidueye card had the same ability as Altaria, but saw a little bit more play in some more niche decks as well. However, it wasn't until Sword and Shield Astral Radiance when wall strategies finally became meta again. First, Miltank from this set had an ability making it immune to V Pokemon, and with lots of Pokemon V dominating the game like Arceus, Miltank was a great basic Pokemon wall option for control decks. However, the big addition from this set, and the one that made the biggest impact, is arguably one of the greatest control cards in Pokemon history. The Silene supporter card flips 2 coins and puts a card from the discard pile on top of your deck for each heads. While sounding pretty bad at first due to being reliant on coin flips, it wasn't that bad, because since you flipped 2 coins, statistically one of them would be heads, meaning you would recover and put at least 1 card on top of your deck 75% of the time. With the Palpad item card that shuffles in 2 supporters from the discard pile into your deck, and the Team Yell's Cheer supporter that shuffles 3 in any combination of supporter and Pokemon into your deck outside of Team Yell's Cheer, this meant that going infinite was now more feasible. With a few Silene and Palpad, 1 Yell's Cheer, and at least 1 Peonia for good measure to fetch key cards out of the prizes, control and wall decks finally had some room to breathe. It all culminated at NAIC 2022, where Sander Wojcik got top 4 with one of the most incredible decks in Pokemon TCG history. This was the Mewtwo V-Union Wall Stall deck. Mewtwo V-Union was a 4-piece card that could only be put into play with all 4 pieces being put into the discard pile, and then the Pokemon was summoned from there. However, the prize cards were such a huge factor, and the reward wasn't high enough to compensate, thus resulting in players considering V-Union Pokemon useless. However, Sander and his group found Mewtwo's true potential. It has 310 HP, an ability making it immune to effects of attacks, which made it immune to things like Giratina V-Star's Star Requiem, and Amazing Rare Yveltal's Amazing Destruction attacks that would normally instantly knock out the active Pokemon. It has the Union Gain attack for 1 colorless energy, accelerating 2 psychic energy from the discard pile onto Mewtwo. This meant that the same turn you summoned Mewtwo, you could use Union Gain to get the energy on it right away to use its other attacks. The main attack that was used was the unbelievable attack Super Regeneration, which heals 200 damage from the Pokemon. With 310 HP, healing 200 every turn was just stupid. And it doesn't stop there. The timing of this deck in the meta could not have been more perfect. The format's big 3 were clearly Arceus V-Star, Palkia V-Star, and Mew VMAX. Arceus decks, aside from the very few that played Crobat VMAX and Dark Energy, had absolutely zero way to one-shot Mewtwo. And funnily enough, their damage output was on average about 200, meaning 1 Super Regeneration could be used to heal off all damage from attacks from Arceus decks for the rest of the game. The same was true for Palkia decks. Palkia V-Star's attack did more damage for each benched Pokemon in play for both players, going up to 260, but with Scoop Up Net, the Mewtwo player could remove all of their benched Pokemon, forcing Palkia to endlessly spam Subspace Swell while Mewtwo shrugged every attack off time after time. However, there was a big problem for this strategy: Mew VMAX. With 4 Power Tablet and a Choice Band, as well as the ability to use Meloetta and Fusion Energy to hit for 280 base damage, they could consistently one-shot Mewtwo. And with Mew VMAX's Attack Max Miracle, which pierces through effects of attacks, this meant you could KO Miltank through its ability. However, Sander thought ahead, and added a few copies of Yveltal with the Cry of Destruction attack, which discards 3 special energy from the opponent's board every turn. And since Mew only played special energy, this meant Yveltal and a few uses of Flannery, which discards a special energy attached to one of your opponent's Pokemon and any stadium in play, you could consistently wipe Mew out of the game by preventing them from attacking ever again. And then you could finish them off with Mewtwo's attack Final Burn, which does 300 damage for 4 energy. Sander got top 4 at the event with this masterpiece, and he almost single-handedly put wall Pokemon back on the map with this innovative archetype. Mewtwo V-Union Wall Stall also ended up winning Toronto Regionals later that year, largely due to the fact it actually matched up pretty well into the big bad of the format, Lugia V-Star, which was regularly reaching 40% usage at each tournament, centralizing the entire format around it. Since Mewtwo could beat other decks pretty consistently with some tech cards, it was a pretty decent play at this tournament and it ended up paying off. However, eventually Mewtwo did phase out, and in its place were some more control-oriented strategies that still incorporated wall Pokemon. With the release of Counter Catcher, Erica's Invitation, and Mimikyu, which was immune to damage from EX and V Pokemon, during the first few Scarlet and Violet expansions, Block Snorlax from Pokemon Go quickly rose to being a Tier 1 archetype, winning 2 regionals and becoming one of the most hated decks of all time. As a Snorlax player myself, I am pretty sad that it's gone now, despite the fact that most players couldn't be happier. With the release of Pidgeot EX and Obsidian Flames, Pidgeot control decks became an archetype, winning regionals with several wall lines like Mimikyu, and eventually, Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon EX. Ogerpon has been a staple of every wall strategy ever since its release, with it being immune to damage from Pokemon that have an ability. With Pokemon like Charizard EX, Goldengo EX, Regidrago V-Star, and many more all having some success, Ogerpon often creeps up to keep these archetypes in check. And it is still being used today, especially with the recent rise of Goldengo thanks to Black Bolt and White Flare. Also in Paldea Evolved, Noivern EX released with the Covert Flight attack, making it immune to damage from basic Pokemon for 2 colorless energy, which made it a good wall Pokemon versus all basic decks like Raging Bolt and Miraidon that were good to varying degrees throughout all of their lifetime. At Baltimore Regionals 2024, Ogerpon and Noivern ended up stealing the show. Nolan Randall from Canada placed top 8 with one of the most interesting decks in Pokemon history. This deck only played Cornerstone Ogerpon and Noivern, but against meta decks like Lugia V-Star and Gardevoir EX, these Pokemon were basically useless. However, the point of the deck was just to bully Charizard, Raging Bolt, and Regidrago, which were arguably the top 3 decks. It was a meta call, and one that would have worked out even better if it hadn't been for the top 8 Lugia infestation that spelled doom for this glass wall of a deck. However, outside of Snorlax and Pidgeot control that did play wall Pokemon, wall strategies weren't really that good for most of Scarlet and Violet. Most of this is due to decks like Lugia and Gardevoir being so good, and wall Pokemon just didn't work good against these decks due to them each playing multiple stages of Pokemon, some of which had abilities, some of which didn't, meaning that these decks could pierce through every wall you face. However, once Lugia rotated and Gardevoir looked like it was dead following the 2025 standard format rotation, as well as the rotation of Canceling Cologne, which could turn off abilities of Pokemon like Ogerpon and Mimikyu, wall decks began to dominate, at least at first. Decks built around Farigiraf EX, which was immune to damage from all basic Pokemon EX, Milotic, which was immune to damage from Terra Pokemon EX like Dragapult and Charizard, and Cornerstone Ogerpon, dominated the Champions League tournament that kicked off this post-rotation format. However, by the time of Atlanta Regionals, the first regional of this format, with walls being so heavily teched for, as well as the revival of Gardevoir, wall decks did so bad that the archetype basically died as soon as the results page dropped on Limitless. This archetype couldn't beat Gardevoir, and as long as Gardevoir was the deck to beat, walls didn't really have a chance. However, this leads us to the present day, where it looks like things might be looking bright for walls. At least right now. Crustle from Destined Rivals is a bulky Stage 1 Pokemon that's immune to damage from all EX Pokemon. With healing and additional damage from the overpowered Monkey Dory, Crustle is actually a decent archetype right now, despite the Gardevoir matchup being, However, Gardevoir, despite winning Worlds, isn't even considered the deck to beat right now. That's Goldengo, and Crustle just so happens to have a very good matchup into the cheese string. So there is hope on the horizon for walls like Crustle, and Cornerstone has popped up in a lot of non-wall decks as a means to counter Gholdengo. Honestly, in my opinion, as long as Gholdengo is the deck to beat, wall decks will always have hope. And right now, it doesn't look all that bad for them. But with Mega Evolution releasing this month, and Gardevoir receiving 5 massive buffs, one of them, Suspicious Clock, actually making its Gholdengo matchup way better, it looks like wall Pokemon might be doomed for a while until Gardevoir rotates. But I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe. Anyways, take care, have a good one.